And so then that's when I will uncomfortably share the part, well, actually, I didn't say anything. And you know why I didn't say anything? Because statistically, I'm not going to say any, if I don't say something in the first 5 years, I'm not going to disclose until I'm in my 40s or until I have kids that reach that age. And I may or may not disclose then.
Welcome to the Louder Than Silence podcast with your host, CG Wagner. This episode is part of the series From Survivor to Leader, where the other staff members and I are having discussions about all things LTS and what it means to be leading the work in long-term care for survivors of sexual violence. It's a mix of our own personal experiences, the work our team does, and how these two things impact each other. Our hope is that survivors feel seen and validated, and supporters gain a deeper understanding of what the healing process looks like. For our episode today, it is Ask Us Anything, Part 1, with an asterisk, hopefully Part 1. For today's episode, we heard from you about what you wanted to know, what you've always been wondering, and what would be helpful to hear. Like everything we do at LTS, we don't make the decisions about what we discuss in a vacuum. It's important that the survivors in our community have their perspectives represented in everything we do. We hope that this will be the first of many of these episodes. With me today, I have our program manager, Joe, development manager, Brittany, and our social media and marketing manager, Christy. Thank you, ladies, of course, for doing this again. All right. So, I realized that we didn't discuss who's going in what order. So, Christy, Joe, Brittany, let's do it that way because that's how I introed you. And thank you for bearing with that. All right. It is one of those everything is not quite aligning kind of days as we're recording this. So, in case you're listening and you're like, "Hey, are these people real?" Very real. This is this is just normal life. All right, so getting started. Our first question today is, quote, obviously at some point in your journey, all of you decided you were okay with telling people you are a survivor of sexual violence. Do you actually feel comfortable with it, or do you feel uncomfortable and you just do it anyway? What was the process you went through that allowed you to reach a point where you thought, yes, I can talk about this as part of my job?
Um, when I first saw this question, I kind of sat with it for a second, well, for more than a second, because I was like, actually, how do I feel about that? So for me, um, it's not about actually feeling comfortable with it. So I don't feel uncomfortable with it. I think it just depends on who I'm talking to. Um, and so, and when, and like the capacity, the space and capacity in which I'm sharing it, you know. And so a lot of times for me, that comes up if, I'm in certain environments and I pick up on different things from the other person. Then I like to communicate like a me too, like, oh, yeah, I've experienced something similar. Um, and that usually opens the door. So I don't necessarily, I wouldn't do it if I was completely uncomfortable because I don't believe anymore in like making myself uncomfortable. Um, and that's been a big shift for me. Sometimes in some of those environments I know that we've talked about before where it's more like kind of religious splaining. It was almost like if you're not telling, then you're trying to hide and cover it or you're ashamed of it or whatever. And there wasn't a lot of care taken in and around that. And so for me, I'm not necessarily comfortable with like just divulging my story. Um, it just depends on like what the bits and pieces are that would be relevant with the person I'm talking to. And I also will ask permission now, like, do you mind if I give some impact or input, not impact, input on that, or if I share something about myself, so that I know if they have the space and capacity to hold, what I'm about to share. So yeah. So to answer your question, I don't have an answer. It's maybe. Maybe I am and maybe I'm not. Who knows? Depends on the day.
Christy, I love that your brain went to like telling somebody in that moment. Like reading the question, I was thinking like that we all here have publicly shared that we are survivors because of, doing this work and being on this podcast right now. um, when you say peer led, like that means that we're one of your peer. Um, and when I think about like what made me like, was I comfortable or uncomfortable when I decided to share that publicly? It's kind of funny because I don't feel like I knew how to sit with comfort or discomfort enough to like know that I was uncomfortable. um, I for me specifically, like I went on this personal journey of like journaling and writing, and I got to a point where it just made sense to publish it. Um, and there was this like, it was just, I don't know how to explain it other than like it was something that I knew I had to do. So I didn't really sit and think about it. It was just like something in me knew that this is a thing I had to do. And so I did it without the like, is this comfortable? And it's also funny, like going back to Christy saying like one on one, like a lot of people in my regular life like had no idea until I like show up with this book being like, here's my whole life story that I never told anybody. um, so I don't, I think part of being a survivor is that you can be so disconnected from your own feelings towards something. And so I don't think that I like had a lot of thought before I just like publicly exposed all of my truths. And with that came triggers that I was not expecting, going public. And then we did have a conversation around like what happens when you tell people your story and it can go poorly. Going public for me, like had people just like bearing their souls. Sometimes people that I didn't know very well, or like, a friend's parent would like message me on social media and be like, oh, here's my trauma. And I was not ready for that, was not comfortable with that, had no idea how to navigate that, and just had to kind of be like, oh, I guess I put myself out there more than I realized. Um, so I don't think it's ever comfortable to just be like, here I am. I do think that there is some like work that you can do to prepare, but even as you're prepared, like as prepared as you can be, it will be uncomfortable. But I would say like I wish I had prepared more, if that makes sense. And then the other part of the question was like, what made you decide to do this as your job? And I actually had, gone through a cohort with Louder Than Silence, and then kind of just was like, I believe in this. I want to continue. So I was volunteering. But I remember having a very this is this is what I'm gonna do now moment. And I was actually listening on audiobook. I was gonna say on tape. That's how old I am. To Chanel Miller's "You Are." No, it's not your own. It's Know My
Say
Name.
my name. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, so I was listening to that book, and she talks about her um, advocate who's like going through this process with her, and how it was so needed to have support. And I like had this moment of like, that's what I'm going to do. Like, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to support women in their path towards facing this part of their story. Um, and that has led me to it being my job. So for me, it was kind of two separate parts.
Um, I think for the most part, I've adjusted to sharing I'm not in a position, especially with Louder Than Silence and with my work, if I start backwards with the second part of the question, where I have to like go into detail or necessarily share my story. It's really, um, which in fact I haven't in my work setting because I am typically networking with people or meeting with people, business owners, who might be interested in supporting Louder Than Silence and explaining what the organization does, while communicating that I personally have benefited from all of the community support and resources. But that really is kind of the extent of it. On a personal level, well, actually, personal and professional. On a personal level, I have shared with people I feel safe with. And even that, I wouldn't call it comfortable, but I think the more you share your story with people who are safe, the less uncomfortable it feels. And even with people, and I'm going to kind of generalize for a second. It is much easier for me personally to speak to most women and females versus males. There are some safe males, very few, that I have been able to have these conversations with, and like less than a handful. Um, I had a friend, and I can't remember how it came up, but I was just talking to a friend couple of mine, that were male and female, and this was fairly recently, so I've been able to share my story a little bit more, and like my trauma just like happened to come up in conversation, but it kind of slid in there. I don't recall exactly how, and I kind of at this point I kind of like Christy said take cues of like how comfortable are they and feel the energy of even on a professional level I can tell pretty quickly now if somebody like does not want to have this conversation because it can be a very uncomfortable conversation for the other person as well, on the receiving end. And so but he asked if he could ask questions because his sister had gone through something similar. And so he was very curious, but he didn't feel comfortable talking with her for whatever reason. And we didn't get into that part. But it was really a wonderful conversation in the fact that how he went about asking like permission to ask questions and then sharing that he had an emotional tie to somebody who had been hurt, and that he was curious to understand more so that I really think he wanted to grow his empathy. Um, so that was a really positive, male experience. But the male and female, and I kind of understood this was coming when I entered the position. Dynamic in the conversations of sharing your story is, for me, it's very real. And there are some females that aren't comfortable speaking about it either. And when I get that kind of feeling, I'll pull back and just talk about the greater good that we're doing.
So it was interesting for me to get the email that had this question in it because I responded to the person immediately with my thoughts and then like put it on here for us to discuss later. And it's kind of curious for me to see the how I immediately responded to it and like as I've gotten to sit with it a little bit more, like how that's kind of unfolded a little bit. That um I don't know if sharing something vulnerable ever feels comfortable. Like I don't know that it ever like gets to that point. I would describe it as tolerable, that it becomes no longer this like massive looming thing. Like when I first founded LTS, like I realized that just being the founder was indicating to people that I was a survivor. And that was very difficult for me because it felt like I was no longer in control of like how people were interacting with that information. And when leading the workshops, I would dissociate so much while sharing my story that I wouldn't have described it as uncomfortable because I was so disconnected that it was only when I became more connected that I actually felt a greater sense of discomfort and then moved from there to it being more tolerable. So it was like a very interesting kind of progression for me and seeing how that worked. But I mean, even now as a founder, we are, oh gosh, 7.5 years into, I am 7.5 years into this work, that it's still not like, sunshine and rainbow and puppy dog kisses when I think about sharing these like hard parts of my story. And I no longer dissociate. I can stay with it. I can like read where other people are at and decide what level I want to share or not with people. Um, and and for me, again, being the founder, right? Being the person who like intentionally specifically decided this is a thing that I'm going to keep doing and talking about, that the journey for me went from like being uncomfortable with the concept of people understanding I'm a survivor because I've created this thing, to then like slowly adding the newsletter and like being able to like share my perspectives there, and then doing an audio version of that, right? So then it's like me like having the inflection of the things that I've written, sharing that into the world, then creating this podcast, and now having like these conversations that are even more in depth, that 7 years ago, this conversation was impossible, right? Like it would just be like not tolerable enough to manage. And with each step, it feels uncomfortable. And what I've realized with that is that we don't really have good distinguishing language between discomfort, because I am taking a big step that is outside of my previous comfort zone, and that feels uncomfortable, versus I'm violating my own boundaries or somebody's violating my boundaries and I feel uncomfortable for that reason. And so I've had to distinguish for myself, like, okay, is this discomfort coming from I'm taking a big step, or is this discomfort coming from somebody's asking questions that feel too prying and I feel required to answer? And now that I'm able to kind of distinguish that better, it's been a very helpful framework for me as I decide what I'm sharing or not sharing with other people. But that's taken, again, over 7 years of doing this work full time to get to that point. So yeah, it's complicated as it turns out.
I was just realizing as we were having this discussion that like out of this group currently, and I know CG has like speaking engagements, so likely shares parts of her story. But right now, as I run programs, I am like actively sharing my story, like on a multiple times a year in a cohort. And then the way that I do intakes, like I'll do an intake video or intake Zoom with somebody who wants to participate, and like offer to share my story as like part of like, here is what it's, here is LTS. And so I've gotten really, really comfortable with just being like, here is the worst thing I lived through. Let's talk about it. And I'm also an artist and a poet. And so I've been currently doing like open mics. And I actually had a conversation on Monday that ended up talking about sexual violence. And being so just like, I think part of it for me, part of my story is that I repressed my memory, and my family ignored the reality that it happened. And so for 27 years, it was like, no, that didn't happen. And so part of it for me is like, yes, it did. Like now I have to like know that it's real. And I felt like I needed to say it was real so many times before I even believed it. So there's a part of it that I think maybe it's the pendulum where I'm like aggressively telling people like this is part of me because it was like cut away or ignored. But it was interesting, Britt, that you brought up the like male female dynamic, because the way that I've had conversations with males is different. But a lot of times, because of the way that I am putting it out there, a lot of times if it's not like it's not a corporate or professional setting, it's like an open mic or something about sex, like assault awareness. And usually it's in a situation where a guy will come up to me afterwards and like kind of quietly be like, hey, so I also, and so it's usually survivors who come up to me and then have their own uncomfortable, like, is it okay if I share with you? Or just usually it's more of a just like, thank you for like owning that this thing exists, because I think again that part of, they probably had so much of their own denial, and so like they see that in me of being like, it happened, and they're like, oh, thank you. So I just wanted to point out like that I get the opposite end of like talking to other survivors, and just how male survivors, I think, struggle a lot to like have the space to have somebody like have that conversation with them. So yeah, I just wanted to point it out.
I was going to add in what I've noticed in regards to male survivors is that oftentimes it was framed for them as like sexual exploration, right? Like childhood curiosity is kind of how it was framed initially for them. And so that's something that I have seen. And then people who, men who haven't navigated any kind of sexual violence. It's been interesting to have conversations like these are just friends, of mine where a husband may make a comment, like, well, why didn't they say anything? Like if it really happened, they would have said something. And so like, when you're having those conversations, it's not offensive to me. It's more like, oh, he needs to be educated. Like, and so then that's when I will uncomfortably share the part, well, actually, I didn't say anything. And you know why I didn't say anything? Because statistically, I'm not going to say if I don't say something in the first 5 years, I'm not going to disclose until I'm in my 40s or until I have kids that reach that age. And I may or may not disclose then. And so it becomes, for me, I kind of look at for the opportunity of like, how can I give them additional information, help them, especially someone who is more like, well, why didn't you say anything? We're talking about like going, coming out publicly. The first time I actually like came out publicly is whatever in an article, because we had navigated like a civil and a criminal and a civil suit, or a criminal case and a civil suit. And so in that article that came out, I had said, it just was one line, she's a survivor of sexual violence or sexual assault. And it was interesting that one line, like, had family members call and they're like, wait, what? You never said anything. And it was funny, like that's what they took away from that was not, the overall encompassing, issue that was being navigated, but instead like, well, you never said anything. And so there, like, I think there's a reason why there's a posture, right, of quiet around it. And it's because in other things, when we say things, it's ignored or it's not listened to, or you might live in a family dynamic where it's not healthy, and so they don't know, like they don't have the tools, to do what they need to do. Which, not to take up time, but like that's why I chose to do this job. Because I totally blanked on that, was like that's what kind of spiraled that for me, like you, Joe, is I was like, oh, also read Know My Name while we were navigating a criminal case, because I was like, no one prepares you for this. So there's not like a course that you can take that goes, hey, when you navigate through the criminal process, man, it's going to feel like shit. And here's all the different things that you're going to have to be prepared for. And oh, by the way, you have this civil thing. And so this is what this is going to feel like. And you're going to feel like you have to prove it in the civil, and in the criminal, it's going to feel different, right? Because the state represents like the state doesn't represent you. And then in our dynamic, there was a church component to it. And so then you're navigating, right, everybody's opinions in that space. And so it just like, I can look back at that, Christy, 5 years ago, I think it's 7 years. I can't remember. It's probably 7 years ago, 20, whatever. Oh yeah, almost 7 years, almost 10 years ago. Shoo. I can look back at that, Christy, and just be like, holy crap. the fact that I didn't like check myself in somewhere, like on an inpatient or something like that, the fact that like it just is baffling to me when I see how dysregulated I was and you're trying to stay regulated for the people that you're caring for in the process and you're not regulated. And so you can actually cause a lot of harm, because you haven't even addressed your own stuff. But so that's what propelled me, to go back to school and do the thing. Of course, in a professional setting, I can't be like, and by the way, yeah, girl, I'm there with you, whatever. You're not able to do that, but that's why LTS is such a beautiful outlet for me, because it is the advocacy work that I care about, and it is the education component, right? Like I feel like we're doing like a crash course in education all the time when we're learning like, oh, that's why I fill in the blank. Like that's why I respond that way. Oh, I had no idea that that's like associated with this. Like I'm not permanently damaged. There's not something wrong with me. It's something wrong was done to me. Right. And so it's just, anyways, I don't mean to preach. Preach it, girl. But yeah. So it's kind of interesting, all those things, guys.
I appreciate you bringing that component into the conversation, though, about what it means to share when you're talking about like criminal and civil cases. Like it's a whole different level than the concept of sharing with family or friends or for your job or whatever. It's like it's significant in a way that a lot of people will never really have to understand. And the level of scrutiny and detail that goes into it that is just so invasive, and sitting in the discomfort of that is a lot. And so I appreciate that you like brought that part of the conversation in, because yeah, that I don't think that's ever going to feel comfortable, right? Like I don't know that there's the ability to go through all of that, like, and be like, yeah, everything felt like peachy keen all the time. Um,
Just drinking lemonade, just having a conversation.
yep,
That's right.
yep. As you were talking in the earlier part of what you just said, Christy, you said about like people contacting you with the like, well, why didn't you say something? And I immediately had so much of my own stuff bubble up when you said that, because I have also had that, like, the frustrated, borderline aggressive, like, how dare you keep this from me kind of stance. And it's just like, okay, do you not understand that I just shared something incredibly painful and personal with you, and now you're upset with me because, like, it was supposed to be on your timeline somehow? Like that, and then like unpacking all of the different components of that, where it's just like, right, so now do I have to wonder every time I share with somebody that I've known for a while if I'm going to get that same response? Like that just like adds this whole other layer to the building the tolerance for it piece. So I get to now sit with that. Thank you. I appreciate you helping me improve my awareness and self-regulation. What a gift, Christy. Thank you.
I have my moments.
Yes. All right. Well, what a great conversation that was. Thank you, ladies. Ready to jump into the next question? All right. Quote, I'm doing so much work, but it doesn't seem like there's much progress. Is that normal? And does it get better?
Yes. Yes, it's normal. Yes, it gets better. Yes, it's normal. It's very normal. I like to do like a scale, where I like to go back and look at how would I've handled that 6 months ago? How would I've handled it a year ago? Am I handling it different? Whatever it is, right? If we're talking about activation or dysregulation or whatever it is, in that healing process, because we say all the time, right? Like healing is not linear, but I have noticed just in a professional standpoint, like people are doing all this work and they've reached stabilization, and then they think that like they're not going anywhere because they've reached a point of stabilization, or someone recognizing, right? Like that amped up feeling of like being dysregulated or being in fight or flight. And all of a sudden they're in a place of more regulated nervous system. And so it feels more like they kind of think, oh, am I depressed? Like I feel kind of meh, like, whatever. And I'm like, well, what feels better? Right? Like, it's just the recognition of, well, maybe this is what a more regulated nervous system feels like, where it can kind of feel meh because they're in the busy of the mundane, and in the mundane of whatever life, right? It's not always exciting, and all of those different things. So I like to think of it through that way. It's like, yes, you're doing all the work. It's very, very normal to feel like it's at its stagnant. Now, if it continues to feel that way, or like I would kind of play fact or fiction with it. Is that a thing? Yeah, I play true false. But like what is true about this that I'm noticing and what is not true about this that I'm noticing? Because it might be that the person you're working with is not a beneficial, right, mix. If you're kind of if you feel like you're staying stagnant, in the same rumination, the same loop, all of those different things. I think the reason why that doesn't stand out to me as much is because, like with EMDR, that's a little bit different. There is a much different approach with EMDR than if someone was doing talk therapy to deal with their trauma. And so then you're in that loop because you're just kind of verbally processing it all the time, but we're not having the integration component, that's offered in EMDR. So. Yes, and yes, and yes.
That's what I wrote too. Yes and yes. I like that you brought in you mentioned like talk therapy versus EMDR. I think that there's a part of this question that is like, well, what is the work? Because you could be doing the work being like, well, I'm going to talk therapy and I've talked about it. Or you could be doing the work of like, I'm doing EMDR, but maybe your EMDR has hit the therapist you're working with like has gotten to the point that they can take you and you need to change, or you need to pause and do something else. Or you could be doing the work where you're like, you are meditating, you are learning ways to calm your system. There's so many different works. And so I think there is a part of like you sitting with like, is the way that I'm working on this still progressing, or do I need to adapt? And also like, is the work that I'm doing, I guess there's one thing that I'm realizing is that I'm working on this all the time. Like, and I have, I'll be running a cohort and we'll do a grounding and then we'll end with a grounding, but then I'll have times where I'll like forget to do that for myself before bed, or I'll start the day off and I want to sleep in. So then I start off dysregulated because I'm chugging coffee as I'm getting kids packed and yelling at them to get out the door. And so I could be doing more work by like waking up 15 minutes earlier and sitting and journaling, which is part of the work. So I think that there's so much to this question, as far as like, is it normal to feel like, am I seeing progress? Or I think part of the question is this like gaslighting dynamic. So a lot of times as a survivor, you have gaslit yourself. Maybe not you, I definitely did. Maybe the person writing this question, it has never done that. But sometimes it's hard to own like, yes, this was sexual violence. Yes, this was what it was. To say it, claim it, and own that this is what you experienced. And it can be a valid go-to to be like, no, it wasn't. No, it was less. No. And just start gaslighting the hell out of it to not have to fully deal with it. And if that is the case, and you have spent years telling yourself this thing didn't happen, then a couple of months or a couple of years of therapy, of working, like doing the work around it, like you may have had a decade of gaslighting it. And so it's going to take some time to undo years and years and years of telling yourself it wasn't what it was, and now like facing it. And then also what Christy brought up is that like non-linear aspect of working on your stuff. CG mentioned that like when she first started this work that she would disassociate when she started sharing her story, right? And so if your go-to is disassociating, then once you do the work of coming into your body and start doing embodiment work, which is its own type of work, but once you start embodying, you can actually feel so much worse, like so much worse. And that's where it's like, it's not linear. That is healing. Like coming and being in this world, being present is healing. And also it can feel like you just took 1,000 steps backwards, because all of a sudden you're like letting yourself feel your emotions. And oh my God, emotions are super overwhelming. And how do I navigate feeling my feelings when I've never felt my feelings? And you can feel like a 2-year-old having tantrums, because the reality is like a 2-year-old is learning how to deal with their feelings. And if you've spent years not, you are going back to that stage of a 2-year-old figuring out their feelings. And if you're 39 like I am and still at about a 5-year-old stage, you can feel really ridiculous. But that is part of the progress. Like that is healing. And the disassociated version of me in public was calm. She got her stuff done. She had a clean house. She worked really, really well. She also seemed to have a wonderful marriage and kids that like she kept calm. She also was never present, never there, had no joy, was exhausted all the time, right? So appearances are not what they seem, and only you can know if like this is progress and if this is healing. And it doesn't always feel like healing because of that, the way the steps work. But if you're doing the work, then yes, you are progressing. It's not linear. Keep going.
I wanted to like clap for you, or like if you're at an open mic night, I'm like snapping. Because it's so true. It's so true. And everything you said, especially at the end, of like, I feel like I've been in therapy most of my life for different things. And many of those things that I was going to therapy for from a young age were actually symptomatic of the sexual violence that I did endure as a young child. So those pieces coming together were a very big aha moment. I was not able to get to the root cause until Louder Than Silence. When I could piece all these together and like, oh, this now makes sense. So when you were sharing, Joe, about, like I too had like the idyllic life and marriage, and I was like the best worker and the best wife and the best mom, and I was dying inside. But during all of that, I was going to therapy and doing what I thought was, and it was work. Like, I don't want to discredit the work I did at that time, because I didn't have all the information, I didn't have all the tools, I didn't have the community prior to that. And so there was a different level of work, and that work was, could be challenging in and of itself, but it felt a little more linear, I think, for what it was. But digging into this type of work and this, I don't want to say subject matter, but this, this trauma work is, it's quite heavy. And when I read it, when I read the question, I was like, I'm 1,000% certain that I asked CG the same question. As I was like getting into EMDR. I think it was like during EMDR. I was like, did she quote me? And I didn't know, and all of these answers were very similar to what CG had shared with me at the time, that healing isn't linear, and I always think of it as like if you're in a dry, like if you're in a dry, I don't know why you would be like at a dry parking lot. I lived in the country for a long time, so we didn't always park on asphalt. It was like you parked on dirt. And when it kicked up, it's just kind of messy and you can't see clearly. And it settles, like it does settle, and you will be able to see. But healing for me feels like this kind of chaotic, like um you think you can see clearly, it gets really messy, and then things kind of settle and you see clearer and clearer and clearer as you go through it and get out of it, work through it. Is what it has felt like for me, doing the work. So my response was it absolutely gets better. Um, and then it gets worse because then you kick up more dirt, and then it gets better and it settles, and then you have uh, like you're triggered and you realize like, oh, I actually need to address something else with this. And or repressed memories come up and you're like, oh, okay, this is big. And I actually need to, address these things. And so the work can also feel continuous, which I think when you realize there's more work than you thought, you're making progress. It just has like long, like the finish line is like a little bit further out and a little bit it grows. And I really naively felt like I was going to do LTS, I was going to participate, I was going to go to some therapy, and I was going to be healed. And that all of those things actually are true, but not in the time frame that I had unrealistically set for myself. And it just looks different. It looks different. It's more complex, and there's more layers, and you're peeling, and sometimes you have to take a break. Like there was a time during my EMDR where I was like, yeah, I need just like a month. I need a second to just sit with this and not do the work, like actively do the work. But I need for me to like be able to pause and breathe. And I did that. And I actually think I took 2 months. I thought it was going to be a month. I got back into it at 2, and then I moved forward. But I even think the pause is work. It's knowing that you like need a breather, that you need a second, you need to sit in it and reset. And so I think progress can just look so different. Definitely not linear, but it's progress nonetheless.
I was going to add in something because, we kind of, when we talk about sexual violence, we often are talking about it in terms of, right, trauma, but the reality is it's a moral injury, right? And so, like, if you think about it from like what embodies us as human beings, there's a moral injury that occurred against us. And so I think that that's why the ripples of all of it, right? Like when you start doing the work, the dust comes up and then it kind of settles down or whatever. And then you notice something else and it pops back up again. It's not popping up in the same degree that it did, but it's popping up in like, oh crap, like that stone that was like thrown in that water, which is actually way too nice of a picture. But you know what I mean? Like all those little ripples that were caused from that and how it impacts my life. Man, because you're just able to, you begin to like be, I don't know, I always point to like the guy with all the red, whatever strings making sense of their lives and realize it's like a madman. So now you know how my brain thinks it's like a madman in here. But it's like connecting all those things and realizing like, oh, that impacted so much, and because of the aspect, like there's new research coming out on the impact of a moral injury, right? And so that is pretty fascinating to be sitting in that research and reading through it and seeing additional stuff that kind of comes up, and so I don't want to be like, you'll never be at the other end of it. I think what we're discovering is, have you ever been around people, they're like, you just got to like set the trauma down and go forward and move on. Well, you can't necessarily do that until you do the work. And the work is every day. It's okay, am I dysregulated? And I might not be dysregulated from anything other than I didn't take the time, like Joe said, to get up 10 minutes earlier to have my coffee before the crazy people came in my house, my people, right? Like moving around or whatever. And so the work is like, I look at the work as like moment by moment. I'm not going to go through life completely regulated Zen, although I think that would be really cool. Because I'm just an excited like person. But I'm more attuned to that dysregulation. And in being more attuned to that dysregulation, like that's the work. It's just moment by moment, whatever it looks like for you, if it's having coffee or if it's going to EMDR or therapy or, like whatever, calling a friend, um, you know, having a social calendar, right? Like having friendships you trust. And I think that was one of the big things with LTS that was so different is that is so set apart from other groups and friend dynamics is like, I'm not having to explain anything in that space. There's zero pressure to explain anything or to be anything. Like I can be wherever I'm in it. And that's such a big difference walking with other individuals with your peers and them having navigated the same, like the similar things, right? The same topic, and them having navigated, similar things, and I'm not having to measure anything because their work, I might get ideas from their work, or their work might need to look different than my work, you know? Sorry, I didn't mean to. I mean, I did mean to. I meant to say everything I just said. I just get so excited about this topic.
I love the excitement, Christy. We need all of us showing up as we are because as you described yourself having the like excited energy, I'm on the other end of things where it's like people assume I'm unflappable and it's just like no, like I'm just like screaming inside my head at the top of my lungs, but it's just like on the outside. I'm like, the duck with the little legs just like paddling furiously underneath. But kind of to what Brittany was saying, I get asked this question a lot, right? And so there's probably some number of people listening to this who are like, "Oh, did CG take that from our conversation?" And so the answer is like both yes and no. Like there's somebody that specifically asked this, and I'm asked this multiple times a week in some version and have been for years. So first of all, like you're not alone, right? Like if you're asking these questions, it's a very normal part of the process. And most of us ask these questions when we're struggling because something feels particularly hard, right? And so recognizing that even reaching out to somebody to say, this is feeling particularly hard is progress, right? Like you're not assuming that like there's something wrong with you and you're not gaslighting yourself and just like stuck in your own head. You're recognizing that there's support systems and there's tools and there's ways to dig out of it, even if you haven't consciously had all of those thoughts, right? But even just recognizing that I know I have someone I can count on who understands me is progress. So, like, congratulations, you're doing it. And when you're in a particularly hard time, it's even harder to hold on to that concept, right? Because I know I felt like once I dealt with all of this, then like life would never feel hard again. And I remember one EMDR session in particular that I had with my therapist where I went into it and I said, I want some tools to help me not feel so overwhelmed. And she's like, CG, do you understand that even people who don't have sexual trauma are overwhelmed sometimes? And I didn't. I honestly, like honest to God, did not understand that people without trauma never felt overwhelmed. Like I assumed that again, like sunshine, rainbows, and puppy dog kisses. Like I'm doing the thing so that like life feels magical and perfect all the time. And it's like, oh, right, I'm doing these things so that I can manage normal life. Right. And like that's the thing. And that doesn't feel like fun and exciting. It's just like, right, like I can get up and face the day and not have to question if I can face the day anymore. And that's that's progress, even if it doesn't feel like it sometimes. So those are all my thoughts. And sadly, we have to wrap up for today. What great conversation. This is very, I loved it. Hopefully everybody listening loves it too. And we have another question that we didn't even get to for this one. So I'm sure we'll have a part two because we at least have one more question. So congratulations, everybody. We have a part two for some time in the future. But for all of our listeners, I do want to say thank you for listening to the podcast. And if you'd like more info, visit our website, louderthansilence.org, or check us out on Instagram at louderthansilence.org. This conversation, all of our work at LTS comes from donations. Everything is provided to our community at no cost. Survivors have already paid enough. So if you want to support this work, please donate today. And don't forget to subscribe to the podcast for the most current episodes. And we'll see you next month.